Imagine being there in this scene in the gospel today. Being alive at a time when there is Jesus. He's available to speak to us and answer questions that we may have. We can bring the things going on in our life to him. Of course, we can still do that, but sometimes it might feel easier if we could see him. So we have this man who comes to Jesus, and he brings one of his big concerns. There's a money dispute in his family. And he wants Jesus, because he's this good teacher, to help solve the wrong that's been done to him. He says, "Tell my brother to share the inheritance with me. He's stolen everything. What belongs that should be mine." And just as sometimes might happen to us when we turn to God in prayer, the answer that he gets isn't exactly what he was looking for. Jesus seems to not want to get involved in any way. And in fact, he seems to be a little bit more harsh on the second brother, because he tells him, "Guard against all greed." So it'd be kind of interesting, well, does Jesus not really care about what's going on in his life? That could be something we might ask at different times from our prayer. When we don't seem to get the answer that we want, doesn't the Lord care? Doesn't Jesus care that the brother has basically stolen stuff? Is that okay? Or is he just going to let him get away with it? But it's clear that if that brother, who actually had taken all the inheritance, were actually there in front of Jesus, Jesus would probably tell him pretty much the same thing, to guard against the greed that has led him to do that. But the reality is that it's only the second brother who's there. The first isn't. And so he has to speak to the second. Make no mistake that the first brother, who stole everything, will have to answer to the Lord if he doesn't repent for what he has done. But while that first brother is guilty of theft, they're both guilty of the sin of greed, for becoming so fixed in their lives on riches and possessions. And that's really the lesson that Jesus wants to teach us today. That's to become so fixated upon money, wealth, possessions, earthly things is not good, because none of these things will last. None of them will last. Of course, God gives us the good things of the world to use for good purposes, to take care of our family, to give to those in need. But we can't allow them to be the thing that controls our lives. And our first reading reflects upon that as well. The book of Ecclesiastes can sometimes come across as one of the most negative books in the Bible, because here it's saying, vanity of vanities, all things are vanities, everything is just pointless. What's the purpose of going out and working each day after day and building up everything? At the end of your life, you die, and then it doesn't belong to you anymore. It goes on to somebody else who didn't earn it. But it's kind of a similar thing that Jesus is portraying in the gospel parable, where you have this rich man who stores up so much for himself, and now he thinks he's going to be able to just rest upon all of that the rest of his life. And of course, that very night, he will die. And where then will all that go? So both the first reading and the Gospels pointing out to us that those things don't last forever. They won't lead us to eternal happiness. We want to store up spiritual treasures, Jesus says. Those are the things that last forever, not earthly ones. These last couple weeks, I've been going back and reading a wonderful spiritual work by St. Francis de Sales, The Introduction to Devout Life. And I really like it because he writes it just for the regular person. He uses a lot of imagery and things that just the normal person can understand for how do we grow in holiness. And in that book, he has a series of meditations that he wants us to reflect upon, to turn our minds to God. And one of those reflections, the very first one, is to reflect upon our creation, that God has created us, that not too many years ago, none of us existed yet. None of us were here. For some of us, it might be a few more years than for others. But there was a point at which we didn't exist. And how did we come into existence? How did you get to where you are today? Was there anybody here that created themselves? No. So everything that you have comes from God and God alone. And that helps us to put things in greater perspective, especially when we think about all of the things that we've come to have. And am I really entitled to all the stuff that I have? Where is it generosity of God where all this has come from? One of his other meditations of St. Francis de Sales is also on our death, which is exactly what Jesus has us meditate with that parable, on our death. That at the end of our life, Francis de Sales says that the different pleasures, the trifles, the worldly joys will be revealed to us as mere shadows and clouds. It can be pretty blunt sometimes. It says then at the end of our life, when we can't maintain any of those things, all of these trivial things will be shown to be trivial and illusions. And we'll wonder, why did I so often turn away from God for basically nothing? Of course, this isn't all negative. Recognizing in our own lives what are those specific things, those earthly things that keep us separated from God, gives us an opportunity to change. Gives us an opportunity to then lift our minds to God and build up treasures for heaven. At the end of his meditations, St. Francis de Sales says one of the most important things that we can do after we've been thinking about these good thoughts about God is to make a very deliberate decision in our life. Because often these things will bring up certain movements of practical things that we should do to change. And so he says, make a deliberate decision to, yes, I'm going to follow that. And I'm going to do that practical thing. So, for example, for these brothers in the gospel, the first brother who's stolen the inheritance, if he were speaking to the Lord, probably his practical decision should be, I'm going to try to make up for what I've stolen. And I will return as best I can to my brother what is rightly his. Of course, the second brother, too, he could make the very deliberate decision to, I'm going to forgive my brother for what he has done to me. So for us, we may have similar things that we struggle with in our lives, but we may be very different. But whatever it might be, to pay attention to the voice of the Lord as to what those practical decisions that we need to do in order to turn away from earthly things controlling our lives, to build up treasures in heaven. If today we hear his voice, let us not harden our hearts, as the psalm is saying. Instead of being weighed down, kept down by the things of the world and attaching ourselves to them, once we can be free from them,